So we've talked about the different dimensions of the crisis that was sweeping through Christendom. You have the crisis of authority between spiritual and secular authorities. You have the crisis of the collapse of the papacy, and its moral and theological credibility, the conflict between councils and popes. You have the Black Plague wiping out a third of Europe's population. You have the 100 Years' War dividing Europe into two armed camps. And then you have the Muslim Turks on the doors, and finally taking Constantinople, the greatest city of Christendom for 1,000 years. And it's in the midst of this crisis, and even while all this crisis is unfolding, that the Christian countries on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, began looking outward and launching colonization, which will change the world forever. We'll start by talking about Portuguese colonization, and it's important to recognize both Portuguese and Spanish colonization as originally actually growing out of this struggle with the Muslims. The Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula, what's now Spain and Portugal, were known as the Moors. Back in the 700s, they had controlled the entire peninsula, but they'd gradually been driven out of most of it, and Portugal had been taken from them during the 13th century. But even so, the Spanish and Portuguese continued crusading against Islam, just as they were being fought at Constantinople and in that area around Greece and Turkey, so they were being fought in Spain and Portugal. The Portuguese were a seafaring people, and so they tended to fight the Muslims at sea. They captured a trade center in Morocco in 1415. And Prince Henry the Navigator established a school for navigators and directed exploration out from that point on Morocco all along the west coast of Africa. The goal was to gain a route to the silks and spices of the Far East on the other side of Islam, since Muslims had blocked the Mediterranean route. But they also hoped to find Prester John, that mythical Christian king that we talked about before. They first started exporting gold from Africa in 1441, and in 1442, they exported the first 10 slaves. Now, it's important to note that this did not begin slavery or the slave trade in Africa. It had existed for a long time, and it had been controlled by Arab slave traders, especially connecting with Christianity, and then African slave traders further south. Arab slave traders had been selling slaves to southern Europe for quite some time. And so slavery did exist in the southern parts of Christendom. And remember, when the Muslims captured Constantinople, they enslaved many Christians. Slavery did not exist at this time in northern Europe, although serfdom did. The first place the Portuguese colonized extensively was the Cape Verde Islands. They brought back 235 captives who they sold as slaves, and some of these slaves were given to the church. They were trained in Latin and in theology in hopes that they could serve as missionaries back to their own people. But few Africans who came and were educated by the Portuguese, let alone few Portuguese people, were willing to go into Africa as missionaries. Still, Christian communities developed on the Cape Verde Islands. And elsewhere, where the Portuguese built trading posts, Christianity began to affect some Africans. In 1455, Pope Nicholas V issued the papal bull Romanus Pontifex to authorize what Portugal was doing. This is a crucial document, and I'm going to read an extensive quote from it. Keep in mind the backdrop of the expansive papal claims to authority that were going on at this time. It said this: the Roman pontiff, successor of the key bearer of the heavenly kingdom and vicar of Jesus Christ, contemplating with a father's mind all the several climes of the world, and the characteristics of all the nations dwelling in them, and seeking and desiring the salvation of all, wholesomely ordains and disposes upon careful deliberation those things which he sees will be agreeable to the divine majesty, and by which he may bring the sheep entrusted to him by God into the single divine fold, and may acquire for them the reward of eternal felicity and obtain pardon for their souls. So notice he's posturing himself. He's Christ's representative. He cares about the whole world. He's called to govern the whole world on behalf of Christ, and he wants the salvation of all people. This we believe will more certainly come to pass through the aid of the Lord, if we bestow suitable favors and special graces on those Catholic kings and princes, who, like athletes and intrepid champions of the Christian faith, not only restrain the savage excesses of the Saracens, Muslims, and other infidels, enemies of the Christian name, but also for the defense and increase of the faith, vanquish them and their kingdoms and habitations. So notice, missions, going out and saving all these pagans and Muslims, goes hand in hand with this crusader mentality of defending Christendom against their attacks. And so it becomes logical then that war, conquest, also becomes a form of missions. He went on to authorize the Portuguese King Alfonso to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. So conquest and enslavement becomes a means by which Christendom is protected and then expanded so that more people become Christians. The said King Alfonso justly and lawfully has acquired and possessed and doth possess these islands, lands, harbors, seas, and they do of right belong and pertain to the said King Alfonso and his successors. So here the Pope is giving Portugal permission to conquer pagan lands, in hopes that it will expand Christianity. He was also giving the King of Portugal power to appoint all bishops in his colonies, a system known as a padroado. So notice here too that negotiation going on between the Pope, who claims all power, but he's delegating a lot of that power, even power over the church, to a Christian king. So extending from this authority, Portugal keeps expanding, and you can see here this map shows quite well, I think, with the dates, how Portugal gradually expands its trade empire around the world. In 1482, slightly different from what this map says, they founded the Cape of Good Hope down here. Sorry, I messed that up. In 1482, they founded a trading post on the Gold Coast, and gradually, right here by the Congo River. And in 1483, they moved up the Congo River, where they encountered the king in the Congo, whose name was Nzinga. He agreed to become their ally in hopes that they would help him against his rivals. So this is a common theme in colonization, where you have a local power who sees the Europeans coming in and thinks, oh, they can help me against my enemy. And as part of this alliance, he accepts missionaries from them. Nzinga is baptized and renamed João, Portuguese name, and his son, Afonso, becomes king in 1506, being raised by this point as a Christian. Afonso was also eager for trade, and at first he was willing to pay for trade goods with slaves. But within a few decades, King Afonso complained that our country, the Congo, is being completely depopulated, and he especially protested the kidnapping of nobility. He asked that Portugal send priests and teachers and stop taking so many slaves. But the Portuguese did not, in fact, send very many missionaries. They focused on trade. And the ministers that they did send tended to focus on ministering to the Portuguese. In 1487, they moved on to Angola, which would become a major source of slaves for the Portuguese. And then finally, they reached, by 1487, 1488, they reached down here, what I mistakenly said earlier, the Cape of Good Hope. From there, they went around and went on to attack Mozambique and other areas in East Africa, where by force they established trading posts. So the Portuguese are expanding, and in the 16th century, they'll move even further into southern and Southeast Asia until they finally reach Japan. Spain was a little bit slower to come to colonization than Portugal. Spain at this point was divided into multiple kingdoms, as you can see from this map, and they had been fighting the Moors for centuries, the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. And by this point, the Muslims only had the Kingdom of Granada, this green one down here. In Spain, crusading, faith, and nationalism all fused together as one and the same force, and this became an essential part of Spanish piety. In 1391, a third of Spain's Jews had been killed, and another third had been forcibly converted as part of this reconquest, or known in Spanish as the Reconquista. As Christians took more and more areas from the Muslims, they treated the Jews more harshly than the Muslims before them had done. In 1476, Isabella, the Queen of Castile, and Ferdinand, the King of Aragon, married, uniting those two kingdoms into one, as you see on this map. And this became key to, they're not united on the side. You see Castile here and Aragon here. So Castile of Isabella and Aragon, whose king is Ferdinand, marry, uniting all these parts of Spain as one, though Navarre remains separate, and then Granada is all that's left for the Muslims. Now, Isabella was a pious queen, and she was devoted to Reformation as well as to strengthening Spain. Working closely with the Pope, she organized an inquisition under the control of Spain, which therefore became known as the Spanish Inquisition. But the Spanish Inquisition became especially notorious because it was much more ruthless than other inquisitions. In the 1480s, it burned about 700 Judaizers. These were Christians of Jewish background who were seen as still being basically Jews. Finally, in 1492, the year that we tend to associate with Christopher Columbus discovering America, in 1492, what was seen as much more significant at the time was that the Muslims were finally driven out of Granada. At the same time, Isabella forced the Jews that were left in Spain to either convert to Christianity or leave the country. And as many as 100,000 Jews fled, many of them to Eastern Europe and the Middle East, creating the phenomena of Sephardic Judaism. But more than that, chose to convert to Christianity. Portugal followed suit in 1497, expelling its Jews or converting them to Christianity. And in the first few years of the 16th century, Muslims were given the same choice, either leave or convert. Jewish converts in Spain, known as conversos, were not trusted. Spain became very concerned about heredity and bloodlines, because if somebody had Jewish background, Jewish blood, they were suspect that they were really a Judaizer. Heathenism and heresy were seen increasingly as being hereditary. So I think it's no accident that as you have nationalism and crusading blending together, nationalism and faith, it leads to a kind of racism, because people that aren't of our nation, who we associate with other faiths, like Muslims and Jews, they become suspect racial groups. People with Jewish blood were blocked for advancement in the church, in its orders, and in its clergy. This is the background for Spanish colonization, because the same year that the Moors were driven from Granada, Christopher Columbus discovered America for Spain, sailing on behalf of Ferdinand and Isabella. Columbus believed God had sent him to America to save its heathen people, who he called Indians, mistakenly believed he had reached the East Indies. He described them as a people who can be made free and converted to our holy faith more by love than by force. So he imagined himself going and by love converting the people of America. He returned the following year with 7 missionaries. But whatever noble intentions people like Columbus might have had in theory, the reality became far more brutal. Many natives died from European diseases. On the island of Hispaniola, anywhere from 70% to 95% of the population died by 1509. So within a generation of Columbus arriving, the vast majority of the population is wiped out on that island. The people were forced to labor as virtual slaves. When the Spanish crown learned what was happening, it intervened. This is not what the crown wanted. And Columbus was actually brought back to Spain in chains. Meanwhile, to prevent conflict between Spain and Portugal, who are the two colonial powers at this point, Pope Alexander VI issued the papal bull Inter Cetera, in which he partitioned the entire world between the two powers. Spain would get America, and Portugal would get Africa and Asia. Now, in 1494, in the Treaty of Tordesillas, this was revised slightly because the Portuguese had discovered Brazil. Back on this map, you can see the Portuguese discovered this part of Brazil, so they don't want to give that up. So the line, which had originally been here, gets moved over here so that the Portuguese can get Brazil, and then the Spanish will get the rest of America. And they had no idea how big that was at this point. The Portuguese saw that as a good deal because it meant they get Africa and Asia. The Pope gave Spain the same kind of authorization to colonize, conquer, and enslave as Portugal had received in 1455 that I read to you from that papal bull. Both countries were given control of the churches in their respective empires, including the right to appoint bishops and collect tithes. The Portuguese, meanwhile, reached India in 1498. They get their hold of Brazil in 1500. They're reaching China by 1513, and they're establishing trading posts wherever they go. The king of Benin sent his son to be baptized and educated by the Portuguese, and a small number of people from Benin converted to Christianity. The Portuguese reached India, conquering Goa, where they killed, you see Goa here, 1510, where they killed 6,000 Muslims while establishing a trading post. Later, they prohibited the practice of Hinduism in Portuguese dominions, which were pretty small and along the coast. As you can see, the Portuguese didn't tend to go in very far. But nevertheless, they forbade Hinduism in Portuguese dominions. And tragically, when they encountered the St. Thomas Christians, who we mentioned earlier, who had been living in India for more than a millennium, they harassed them as heretics. They did not view them as true Christians because they weren't Catholic. Meanwhile, Spain gradually spread its control in the Caribbean and in parts of Central America. And this map gives you a better sense, going much further than we are, of course, into the 1600s, into the expanding Spanish Empire. What I want you to see is that colonization here was an extension of the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain from the Muslims, which means that colonization was really an extension of the Crusades, in which the Indians were basically treated like the Moors and like Jews. And it was brutal, but many Christians at the time thought, yeah, this is how Christianity often expands. If you go back to the early Middle Ages, which we don't cover in this class, many parts of Europe had become Christian after they were first conquered. And so, and it's also important to note that when many of these people were conquered, when they encountered European power, they typically saw the power of the Europeans as proof that their God was powerful and that their God was real. And so while we tend to look back and see the use of power and its connection to Christianity as compromising the integrity of the faith and making it less plausible, people back then actually often responded in the opposite way, where the power of Europeans, Christian Europeans, seemed to prove the power of their God and the powerlessness of the pagan gods. And so many of these natives in America and Africa and Asia who had such close encounters with colonizers accepted Christianity precisely because they believed the Christian God had conquered their gods. Now, after these colonizers went, they were followed by Franciscan and Dominican priests who acted as missionaries to try to save as many natives as possible. But they often would baptize natives en masse, whole crowds of them, without hardly any training or catechesis, in hopes that just baptizing them would help save them. When Spain conquered the Canary Islands in the 1480s, off the coast of Spain, Franciscan missionaries argued against enslaving Christian natives, and sometimes even argued against enslaving heathens. And so in 1500, in contrast to Portugal, this is an interesting point, Ferdinand and Isabella forbade the enslavement of Indians. But what they substituted instead became just as bad. They established encomiendas, or trusts. This was an old tradition in Spain in which a soldier was rewarded for his military service by being granted the labor of his defeated enemies. The idea was that he would get their labor as his reward. They were his enemies, but he would treat them well and teach them Christianity. But in practice, the result was worse than slavery. The masters had no incentive to treat their laborers well because they weren't their property, right? If you have a slave, at least it's your property, so you want to treat them somewhat well, but in this case, they didn't even have that, and they often worked them to death. Missionaries protested, and I think it's important to see in all of these colonial type contexts, you have the people who are exploiting these conditions and abusing people, and then you have others who are protesting against it. In this case, missionaries and the crown don't necessarily agree with what the wealthy landowners and soldiers are doing. Antonio de Montesinos, a Dominican, preached a sermon to his fellow Dominicans in 1511. He said, "This voice declares that you are in mortal sin, and live and die therein by reason of the cruelty and tyranny that you practice on these innocent people. Tell me, by what right or justice do you hold these Indians in such cruel and horrible slavery? By what right do you wage such detestable wars on these people, who lived mildly and peacefully in their own lands, where you have consumed infinite numbers of them with unheard of murders and desolations? Why do you so greatly oppress and fatigue them, not giving them enough to eat, or caring for them when they fall ill from excessive labors, so that they die, or rather are slain by you, so that you may extract and acquire gold every day? Are they not men? Do they not have rational souls? Are you not bound to love them as you love yourselves? Be sure that in your present state you can no more be saved than the Moors or Turks, who do not have and do not want the faith of Jesus Christ." This is a very prophetic moment for this Dominican, where he is speaking out against what his own supposedly Christian people are doing, supposedly in the name of the gospel. And it's that same tension that you always see in Christianity between those who use Christianity as an excuse to exploit or for their own wealth, and those who genuinely seek to follow Christ. In Cuba, natives led by a man named Hatui fought back. Hatui said that the reason the Spanish were so brutal was because gold was the god of the Christians. Eventually, he was captured and condemned to death by being burned at the stake. But a Franciscan tried to evangelize him before he died, saying that if he became a Christian, he could go to heaven and avoid hell. So Hatui asked if Christians went to heaven. And when the Franciscan said that the good ones do, Hatui replied that then he would prefer to go to hell. Now, the Spanish crown, as I mentioned, did try to protect the natives, but it's way on the other side of the Atlantic, so it has little practical power in America. But it passed the laws of Burgos in 1512, which regulated relations and outlined the rules for further conquests. But the laws were rarely enforced, and the rules of engagement that the crown gave simply produced the document I had you read, the requerimiento. And this was an announcement that would be read to different native groups when the colonizers encountered them. And it would inform the natives of the papal bulls, the papal decrees of the supposed vicar of Christ, who gave Spain its authority and commanded the natives to submit to the Pope as the sovereign of the world, Christ's vicar, and to Spain. And if they refused, they were seen as refusing the gospel, which gave Spain the right to conquer them. So this is the state of affairs on the eve of the Reformation. Europe in crisis, but all of a sudden rapidly expanding. Portugal and Spain channeling their crusading spirit into the Americas, Africa, and Asia, even as the Turks are on the gates of Europe, taking Constantinople, and the church in the West, the Catholic Church, at a point of the lowest credibility it's been at in a very long time. And obviously we'll continue that story when we look at the Reformation.